Before we get started, on this Saturday, March 25th, aliens are invading Ferndale, and you can be a part of it. Starcut Ciders is completely transforming 215 West into an interplanetary experience. The bartenders will be shaking up cocktails featuring Starcut Ciders and mocktails featuring Thirst Mutilator. Drag performances from Miss Michigan Trans Gay World Mia Cole, Mr. Trans Michigan Michael Christian, Jewel Jubilee, and Bentley James. DJs spin all night while go-go dancers from outer space entertain. Grab your tickets today by going to ferndalepride.com and clicking on upcoming events. That's ferndalepride.com and click or tap on upcoming events. I'll also put a link in the show notes. All ticket sales help keep Ferndale Pride free to the public. Hello, friends, and welcome to your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023. I'm Chair Stays, and today, a bit of Detroit's past that has ties to today. If you've paid attention to the financial news at all lately, you know of the failures of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and the recent Swiss government-supported buyout of Credit Suisse. And you know this isn't the first time there's been bank issues, or in the case of Silicon Valley Bank, a bank run. In fact, a huge bank run here in Detroit in 1933 helped shape policies so that the now FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, insuring people's deposits, became a reality. In the heart of the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover was on his way out of office after what many historians think was a failed presidency. Between trade wars and providing no direct relief to citizens, Hoover not only made the problems from the 1929 crash worse, he became hated and lost the presidency in a landslide, only winning 6 out of 48 states at the time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just been elected, and our story is in the lame duck period between the two. For the previous couple decades, Detroit was an up-and-coming economic powerhouse. It had been growing at a fast clip, and only a few years before the now Guardian Building, literally dubbed the Cathedral of Finance in downtown Detroit, had been completed for one of Detroit's high-flying banks. In fact, it was called the Union Trust Building for the bank inside it. That building was built with the exuberance and style that can only be funded by a boom time. It is a beautiful relic of Detroit's economic heyday, but also a marker of a sort of end. After its completion due to economic conditions, so many projects were halted and dreams dashed in the Motor City that some would argue that this is the true beginning of the decline. For instance, the iconic Fisher Building was going to be 3 towers, but as you see today, it is only 1. The events of this era are what killed those plans. Detroit was never the same after this. The city in many ways lays dormant until World War II, and the often talked about arsenal of democracy, building war machinery, fired up and was an economic savior. Factories spread out, in part for protection from bombing runs that did not happen, but in reality, the land was also cheap. Federal policies impacted how Metro Detroit built and the city's trajectory as well. Racist redlining policies meant that those coming back from the war could only buy and build in the suburbs, and Detroit's large black and brown population was not eligible for the same benefits upon their return, even though they provided the same service. The age of autos came, and suburban development eventually helped lay the foundation for the geographically sprawling Metro Detroit we see today, and a core city that in 2023 is about 1 million people smaller than during the Great Depression. In some ways, Silicon Valley today is the Detroit of 100 years ago. Innovation, industry, people were dragging their prototype engines into downtown hotel bars to raise funding. A series of functions, apps if you will, like heaters, tires with air in them, front-wheel drive, better suspensions with shock absorbers and more, made their way to the platform that is the car. Marketing changed too. It wasn't about listing the specs and the value. Car companies that found success and profit were the ones that appealed to emotion, status, paint colors, flashy advertising. Hundreds of car companies turned into dozens that then consolidated into the Detroit 3 we have today. It's much like tech is now, in the eyes of the public anyway. Alphabet or Google, Amazon, Apple, Meta or Facebook, and Microsoft. That runs the table. Does any of that seem familiar to you? I'll note that things are very different now, too. This isn't the same country in so many ways as 90 years ago, and it's not the same loose regulations. We're not as afraid to step in and stop the panic. But I share this story because history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. So what happened in 1933? Well, I can't interview anyone involved in this from the time. So let's examine it with a detailed account. I'm going to share my reading of the words of Francis Gloyd Awalt. He was the acting comptroller of the currency of the time. This is from his report to the St. Louis Fed after the dust had settled. Awalt was appointed by President Hoover near the tail end of his administration and stayed on until Roosevelt appointed his own man for the job. In 1932, when Awalt came on, Hoover had thought the trouble was over. In 1931, nearly 2,300 banks failed. Turns out it was just the calm before the storm. Before we get started, unless I otherwise note for modern context, the dollars here are in 1933 numbers. As I record this, $1 in 1933 is equal to more than $22.60 or so today. So, now to the words of Francis Gloyd Awalt. What proved to be the straw that broke the camel's back occurred in Detroit, Michigan. Sometime in 1930, a drain approaching the proportions of a run began on the large banks in Detroit. In a period of about 2.5 years prior to February 11th, 1933, about $250 million, or almost $5.7 billion in 2023, was withdrawn from the First National Bank of Detroit. And large sums were also withdrawn from the Union Guardian Trust Company and the Guardian National Bank of Commerce. In order to meet these withdrawals, the First National Bank was compelled to liquidate practically all of its liquid and unpledged assets, and the Union Guardian Trust Company was compelled to borrow from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and from the Ford interests. Mr. Edsel Ford was chairman of the board of the Union Guardian Group. In January of 1933, the run was continuing without abatement, and the Detroit banks were losing from $2.5 to $3 million a week. The banks could not continue to pay out money at this rate without further borrowing. Two banking groups were dominant in Detroit: the Detroit Bankers Company Group and the Union Guardian Group, or Ford Group. The Detroit Bankers, formed in 1930, owned all of the stock of the First National Bank of Detroit. The People's Wayne County Bank later merged, all of the stock of the Detroit Trust Company, 8 suburban banks in Michigan, and all of the stock of an investment affiliate known as the First Detroit Company. The Guardian Detroit Union Group, or holding company, held the stock of the National Bank of Commerce, the Guardian Union Trust Company, and a number of other banks, one in Flint, Grand Rapids, Battle Creek, and Jackson. The Guardian Trust Company attempted to borrow further funds from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. In order to accomplish this, Henry Ford was asked to subordinate or provide debt financing that is ranked behind what is held by secured lenders in repayment order, some of the amount owed to the Ford interests as a new loan. He refused to do this, and it seemed obvious that if the Guardian Trust Company could not meet withdrawals, a chain reaction would occur in the group and spread. It was thought wise to send someone high in the administration to Detroit to confer with Ford. Those chosen were Arthur A. Ballantyne, Undersecretary of the Treasury, and Roy D. Chapin, Secretary of Commerce. A meeting was arranged by Mr. Ford by President Herbert Hoover. The Ford interests had on deposit $7.5 million at the Guardian Trust Company, about $17.5 million at the Guardian National Bank of Commerce, and about $25 million at the First National Bank of Detroit. Secretary Chapin and Mr. Ballantyne met with Mr. Henry Ford, Mr. Edsel Ford, and Mr. E.G. Liebold in Mr. Ford's office at Dearborn on February 13, 1933. This was a legal and a banking holiday since Lincoln's birthday fell on Sunday, February 12th. According to the signed report of Secretary Chapin and Mr. Ballantyne stated that they were there to discuss the acute situation existing with reference to the Union Guardian Trust Company of Detroit and a plan which had been worked out to enable the trust company to remain open. Mr. Henry Ford stated at once that he knew about the plan and that he would not agree to do what he understood had been proposed he do, but that he would be glad to discuss the situation. Mr. Ballantyne then stated that the difficulty was that the Union Guardian Trust Company had deposit liabilities of some $20.5 million that it already had a loan with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to the amount of some $15 million and secured by the pledge of assets, and that the remaining free assets of the bank subject to pledge were the face value of some $6.3 million with a loan value of not exceeding $5 million. A plan had been worked out under which the Guardian Group would pay into the trust company, or some company to be formed, assets of a loan of some $3.6 million, so that $8.6 million in loans could be made by the RFC for the purpose of furnishing funds to the trust company. This loan was to be part of the larger loan aggregating about $23 million, the purpose of which was to provide further liquidation for the Guardian National Bank of Commerce and certain units of the Guardian Group. This larger loan had been agreed upon with representatives of the Guardian Group as sufficient for the purpose of the needs of the other units. However, Mr. Ballantyne called attention to the fact that this loan would leave a gap of some $11 million to $13 million in the assets of the trust company, and to make this up, it was proposed to subordinate the deposit liabilities of the trust company to the amount of at least $9 million, thus leaving a balance of some $4 million to be supplied by new cash. It was also necessary to have $2 million in cash to furnish the capital for the mortgage company it was proposed to organize, which would be the actual applicant for the RFC loan and a vehicle for the proposed financing transaction. As part of the transaction, the deposit liabilities of the trust company would be assumed by the Guardian National Bank of Commerce, which would receive from the trust company cash assets to make good the liabilities so assumed. Ballantyne pointed out that the plan had been formulated on the basis that deposit liabilities of the trust company to the Ford company in the amount of $7.5 million would be subordinated, and that, in addition, part of the new cash required would have to be supplied by the Ford interests. He said that those having given consideration to the plan felt that so worked out, it would enable the trust company to continue as a trust company and the Guardian Group to continue its banking activities. Mr. Ford stated at once that he would not subordinate the $7.5 million in deposit liabilities held by the Ford Motor Company. He stated that he had said some 2 or 3 weeks earlier that this might be done, but he had not fully understood the plan. In any case, his determination was that he had changed his mind and that he would not do this. Mr. Ballantyne stated to Mr. Ford that his decision would make any plan for saving the trust company impossible. He further said that if the trust company could not be saved, it was the opinion of those who would consider the situation that the Guardian banks would be forced to close. The consequences of this would throw great pressure upon the First National Group and all other banks in Michigan, and that pressure would probably very soon extend outside of the state. Mr. Ford reiterated that he would not agree to make the subordination of Ford deposits in the trust company. He further stated that if the trust company was not kept open, he would immediately, on Tuesday morning, withdraw from the First National Bank the Ford deposits of $25 million. Mr. Ballantyne asked whether he had understood Mr. Ford correctly. Mr. Ford said that he had, and that Mr. Ballantyne was free to immediately report his position to the RFC and those working in Washington in connection with the situation. Mr. Ballantyne then said it seemed clear that the Guardian Group could not survive, that the withdrawal of the Ford account from the First National Bank of Detroit would make it very much more difficult to preserve that bank, and that if that bank could not survive, it was difficult to see how any Michigan banks could be kept open. This, he stated, would cause vast distress in the state of Michigan, as there were nearly 1 million bank depositors representing the source of support of as many as 3 million people. All of these people would be subject to loss and suffering, and that the business side of the state would be vastly hampered, if not paralyzed. The situation so resulting could not be confined to Michigan and would probably communicate itself to neighboring states, and some reflection would be felt among banks elsewhere. He said that if similar results developed throughout the nation, the consequences would have an effect not only on business, but on the lives of the people and on social developments, which it was very difficult to foresee. Mr. Ford then went on to say that he did not think Mr. Chapin or Mr. Ballantyne understood the situation at all. He said that this trouble and this effort to talk him into the plan came from sources of which they did not know about. When questioned, he stated it was part of the operation of the same source which had brought about the strike at the Briggs plant for the purpose of harming or destroying his business. He felt that it was due to some of his competitors or some of the people behind them. Mr. Chapin then told Mr. Ford that he desired to talk to him as a fellow manufacturer of Hudson Motors, with whom he had good relations for many years. He felt that he and Mr. Ford were in the same position as they each had independent companies. Mr. Ford said that was so, except for the fact that Mr. Chapin's stock was listed on the stock exchange. Mr. Chapin said that as a manufacturer, he felt that the consequences to the industry of the tying up of the banks in Michigan would be to add immensely to the already serious difficulties of the business. He pointed out that while some years ago it had been thought that automobiles were in the class of consumer goods, During the period of the Depression, it had become clear that old cars could be retained longer than had been anticipated, and that under present conditions, the purchase of new automobiles was regarded as almost a capital expenditure. He said that such purchases, even for low-priced cars, required the expenditure of relatively large amounts, and that if the people of the country were made still further short of funds, that would certainly drastically curtail purchases. He said that it was very hard for him, as a manufacturer, to contemplate such a development and that he could not see how Mr. Ford could possibly want to face such a situation. Mr. Ford said that great adverse financial development might have a very bad effect upon the industry, but that, even if the effect were so bad that his company would be destroyed, he would proceed to start a new one and believe that he could again build up a business as he still felt young. Mr. Chapin then spoke to Mr. Ford about the immediate effect upon the local situation, saying that he believed Mr. Ford must feel a deep interest in the future of Detroit and its people. It would seem a very strange thing for Mr. Ford, in effect, to turn his back on the course which he had pursued and failed to help stave off the threatened adversity. Mr. Ford said that people here, and all people, might have to go through the experience of a crash. The general effect would be that everybody would have to get to work a little sooner, and that might be a very good thing. In any event, it had to come. There were further pleas made to Mr. Ford, but he said he would not subordinate or in any way contribute a single dime, as he felt that the principle was wrong. He stated that he felt he had already done everything he should to help the trust company. Mr. Ford at times approached the point of irritation and suggested that Mr. Ballantyne and Mr. Chapin might be making threats. They told him that they were not trying to, and certainly not threatening, but that they felt it was their absolute duty to point out to him with the utmost clearness what was believed to be involved in the situation and his decision. Mr. Ford stuck to the point that the crash had come and stated that the only terms on which he would subordinate his deposits to the trust company would be to receive from them endorsed notes, which would be absolutely good. Mr. Chapin remarked that Mr. Ford always claimed the right to change his mind, and he hoped he would think over most carefully all they had said and let them know if there was any change that day. Mr. Ford remarked that the trust company was dead anyhow. Mr. Chapin said Mr. Ford should reflect on the point that the corpse might communicate disease over a very extensive area. Mr. Ballantyne and Mr. Chapin reported their conversation to those working on the plan in Detroit. It was suggested by Mr. Melvin A. Traylor, president of First National Bank of Chicago, that the result might be that banks over wide areas, if not generally, might have to go on a clearinghouse certificate basis, and wanted to know whether Mr. Ford fully realized this point. It was thought that it had been covered, but Mr. Ballantyne called Mr. Liebold in regard to it. He also asked Mr. Liebold if he was absolutely right in his understanding of Mr. Ford's withdrawing his entire deposit from the First National Bank, and Mr. Liebold stated that that was certainly what Mr. Ford had said. At about 4:30 that afternoon, Mr. Liebold called and said that there had been no change in Mr. Ford's position in any respect. That message appeared to entirely end any hope of saving the trust company through Mr. Ford. A meeting was called in the office of Mr. Eugene Meyer, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, with respect to the Detroit situation early on February 13th. There were present members of the board, members of the staff of the board, myself, and at times members of my staff. As information came in from Detroit, telephone conferences were held with various officials, including Mr. Jesse Jones of the RFC. It was apparent that the situation was so serious that a joint meeting should be held. Such a meeting was held in the boardroom of the RFC, at which were present, in addition to board members and staff, Governor George L. Harrison of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, members of the Federal Reserve Board, Mr. Floyd Harrison, administrative assistant to Mr. Meyer, Mr. Chester Morrill, secretary to the Federal Reserve Board, Mr. W.P. Folger, chief national bank examiner, and myself. After some discussion, Senator James Couzens and Senator Arthur H. Vanderburg were invited to join the conference, since not only was the state of Michigan involved, but also because Senator Couzens, through his long association with Mr. Ford, might be able to prove of some help with Mr. Ford in working out the situation. The question of a banking holiday in Michigan was discussed, as well as what could be done in lieu of such a holiday, such as the issuance of clearinghouse certificates, as was done in the Panic of 1907. I was at the time against a banking holiday in Michigan. I felt sure it could not be localized and they would spread to other states. I knew we had a situation entirely different from the Panic of 1907, which was a money panic, when the certificates were used generally for clearance between the banks themselves. In the situation we were facing, the question of soundness of assets was present, and clearinghouse certificates could not be issued in the same way as 1907. Moreover, many places where it would have been necessary to issue the certificates had no clearinghouse. I advocated, under the circumstances, that clearinghouse certificates, if they were issued, be issued on a partial basis, depending on the value of assets of the various banks. That is, one bank up to 80% of assets, another 60%, etc. Or that we go on the script plan called the Broderick or New York plan. I was generally opposed on this except by Governor Harrison, who, much to my surprise, supported me. However, as further word came in from Detroit, it became evident that the issuance of certificates was not possible in any limited time. The key to the situation was Mr. Ford, and there need be no issuing of clearinghouse certificates or declaring of a bank holiday if he could be persuaded to go along with the plan which had been discussed with him that day. So Senator Cousins was requested to talk to Mr. Ford by telephone. He did, and urged Mr. Ford to go along with the plan submitted to him. Mr. Jones and I listened in. I was particularly interested in finding out whether or not Mr. Ford would state that he would withdraw his deposits from the two national banks if the trust company did not open the following day. Mr. Ford again so stated. He also made it very plain that he would not go along on the plan proposed. At the resumption of the conference, I told the conferees that I had no choice under circumstances but to refuse to let the two large Detroit banks open the next day because I could not let Mr. Ford have preference to the detriment of the other depositors in these institutions. Constant contact was being kept with Mr. Ballantyne in Detroit, as well as with Mr. John McKee, the chief examiner for the RFC, and Mr. A.A. Leyburn, chief national bank examiner of that Federal Reserve District. Mr. McKee had been sent to Detroit about February 9th to head the team of examiners going over the assets of the two groups of banks, and he had worked out the plan for the Guardian Union Group, which was presented to Mr. Ford. In substance, the Guardian Group's free assets at face value were nearly $68 million. The loan required for the group was a little under $49.5 million. The Detroit Clearinghouse had been advised of the situation and was meeting. The governor of the state had been called into the clearinghouse meeting, and after Senator Cousins talked with Mr. Henry Ford, the meeting was advised of the discussion through Mr. Ballantyne and urged to prevail upon the governor to declare a banking holiday in the state. Governor William A. Comstock declared a banking holiday for Michigan about 1 a.m. February 14th after the request for such a holiday was placed in writing. The holiday was declared for a period of only 8 days, but it was later continued up to the date of the beginning of the national holiday, March 6th. Needless to say, Mr. Ford was unable to withdraw the funds in the various banks prior to the banking holiday. I'm going to cut the story right here. A little historical note on why March 6th mattered. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt proclaimed a bank holiday beginning that day in 1933. It shut down the banking system across the country to help calm the panic that had started in Detroit. When the banks reopened on March 13th, depositors stood in line to put their cash in the banks. The plan worked. Our banking system is based on trust. We as a nation got a lesson from Detroit and, well, in a way, Henry Ford in the 1930s, and sometimes need to remind ourselves that capitalism needs guardrails to stop greed, mismanagement, and the worst habits of human nature from driving the economy into a ditch. That's it for your Daily Detroit for today. Thanks to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/Daily Detroit for supporting us. In this media environment, it takes local support from our members and local organizations and businesses to keep local media alive. Feedback, as always, dailydetroit@gmail.com. I'm Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you are somebody, and I'll see you around Detroit.